Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presidential lecture. As you probably know, Lancaster History is a membership history organization, and membership makes history happen. Thanks to our members, Lancaster History is able to bring a number of dynamic speakers to the podium for our lecture series throughout the year, and provides additional exciting benefits such as Yuletide at Wheatland. Be sure to check out our website in the near future for details on reserving your visit to the Yuletide season. President James Buchanan, his home will be decorated for the season starting the week of November 22nd. So please take a moment to learn more about our membership and events at lancasterhistory.org. Before I introduce Matt, I want you to know that I will reappear on the screen to kick off and keep track of time for our Q&A period at the conclusion of tonight's remarks. Tonight, we are pleased to have Lancastrian Dr. Matt Pinsker as our speaker. Matt is the Pohanka Chair of Civil War History at Dickinson College, located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he also serves as director of the House Divided Project, which is an innovative effort to build digital resources on the Civil War era. Matt has held visiting fellowships at the U.S. Army War College, National Constitution Center, and the New America Foundation. Dr. Pinsker is a graduate of Harvard College and earned his PhD in modern history from the University of Oxford. He's the author of Abraham Lincoln, published by CQ Press, and Lincoln's Sanctuary, Abraham Lincoln and the Soldier's Home, published by Oxford University Press. His next book is forthcoming from W.W. Norton and Company, tentatively entitled Boss Lincoln, Understanding Abraham Lincoln's Partisan Leadership. Matt, I hand you over the audio.
So thanks, Pat. I am honored to be with you guys tonight. Like Pat said, I'm from Lancaster. I went to McCaskey. My dad taught at F&M, so I kind of grew up in the shadow of Wheatland. I'm not really a Buchanan scholar. I'm a Lincoln scholar, as you can tell from my books. But of course, I have studied and learned a lot about Buchanan, especially in the last several years when I've been working on something called the Dickinson and Slavery Initiative, which is why I'm here tonight. We have been exploring the college's connection to slavery and anti-slavery, and it's led to a series of reports and exhibits, reevaluations of our commemoration on campus. We're going to have a renaming ceremony for a dorm in November with descendants of formerly enslaved employees of the college whose names will now be put on a residential dorm. I'll talk maybe about that a little longer when we're doing Q&A. But of course, since Buchanan was class of 1809 at Dickinson, we reevaluated his connection to slavery. And that's the subject of my talk tonight. That's why Pat asked me to come and speak to you. Was Buchanan a slaveholder, and why that might matter? It's a more complicated question than it looks. I was, of course, excited to come and talk about this. But just, in the last several weeks preparing for this lecture, I learned a whole lot more than I had known before. And I'm excited to share with you, really, I think, a new documentary discovery that somebody else made, but that I'll publicize. And then also some context that I think I can put that discovery into in a way that I hope will make sense. But you'll see for yourself, and we can talk about it during the Q&A. And then the other thing I wanted to do tonight, which is kind of to celebrate an intersection of a whole bunch of different historians who are working on issues related to this. And I'll try to do this as I talk, and then I'll make sure to highlight it at the end. But what Pat has done by bringing me into this is, he's connected public historians and academic historians and different generations of academic historians, because I'm going to talk about a bunch of work from a new generation of graduate students who have pioneered some insights into what slavery was like in Pennsylvania after gradual abolition in 1780. And I'll also manage to talk about some journalists who've been working on this for a number of years, as well as other types of public historians who've created exhibits online that have made research on this more possible. So I'll try to bring it all together. And like I said, I am kind of thrilled to be able to share this with you and interested to hear your response to what I consider to be new information. Now, what I'm going to do first is a kind of overview presentation. I'll share my screen and I'll show you some slides from a PowerPoint, and we'll talk about this subject in some greater depth. I can take questions during that presentation, but I'll try as best I can to wrap it up in 20 or 30 minutes and then have Q&A about it. And then maybe I'll talk a little longer about the Dickinson and Slavery Initiative. So that's my plan. Let me go to a share screen here. So, was James Buchanan a slaveholder, and why that matters? That picture you're looking at on your screen right now, or that you should be seeing, was a lithograph, a political cartoon from 1857, showing James Buchanan helping a slave catcher chase after a freedom seeker or a runaway. This, of course, is about the politics of the 1850s for most of his contemporaries, but for our purposes, the question is, did James Buchanan have any more direct personal connection to slavery? And there is a story in the famous biography of Buchanan, the kind of definitive study of him by Philip Klein, that has been repeated over the years in many different forums. And I wanted to, highlight it for you here. There's a passage in the biography that describes a moment when Buchanan was a younger politician in 1834, visiting his sister Harriet. It says here, after a stop at Bedford Springs, he made a trip to Greensburg in 1834 and saw his sister Harriet, who had married the Reverend Robert Henry. There, Buchanan learned to his dismay that Henry's family in Shepherdstown, Virginia, owned 2 slaves. This was political dynamite, and he lost no time in informing his brother-in-law that he wanted to buy those slaves into freedom. And then Klein goes on to say that Buchanan executed a kind of deed of manumission where Henry's family manumitted, freed the 2 slaves, a young woman in her early 20s, and her 5-year-old daughter. And then Buchanan indentured them as servants. The mother for 7 years and the younger daughter until she was 28. And he leaves the story there, describing it as a kind of win-win for Buchanan. He avoided the political dynamite of having slaveholders in his family, and he got some servants that he needed. This is right around the time he was still living on King Street then, just hiring Miss Hetty, Esther Parker, and was looking to get more support for his household staff. And that story has been repeated in different formats in different ways over the years. And so we use that in the Dickinson and Slavery Initiative, but we were always curious about going to the sources that Klein used. And so I started talking to Pat, and he told me that there was a retired nuclear engineer and local historian in Mercersburg, a guy named Dan Guzzi, who had actually gone to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and received copies of the documents that were behind the passage that I just described to you from Klein's biography. And you're looking at a portion of the document there, and I have made a little transcript of part of it. This is Anne Henry, the widow of Shepherdstown, who has, for a consideration of $250 from Buchanan, said that she has decided to set free my 2 female slaves, Daphne Cook, aged 22 years on the 22nd day of October last, and her daughter Ann Cook, aged 5 years. And this was a document filed in Jefferson County courts in 1835. The first part of the document was from March 10th, 1835, this deed of manumission. There's a further passage here that reads, upon this express condition, however, that the said Daphne and Anne shall remove from and leave the state of Virginia immediately, and that the said Daphne shall be bound according to the laws of Pennsylvania to serve the said James Buchanan, his executors, administrators, or assigns during the term of 7 years from the date hereof, and also that the said Anne shall in like manner be bound to serve the said James Buchanan until she shall attain the age of 28 years. So there it is in writing. That particular passage, of course, should create some familiarity with most of you. People who are familiar with Pennsylvania will know enough to know that the context of servitude in Pennsylvania after 1780 was associated with the regime of gradual abolition that had been started by legislative act that year. The 28 years was the term that the legislature had ultimately provided for the children of the enslaved. Black children born to enslaved mothers after 1780 were not chattel, they weren't human property. They were to be designated as servants, and they were to be held as bonded servants until 28, if the masters so choose, before they would be freed. That's why the Abolition Act was gradual. The slaves who were alive before the act was passed were to be continued to be held for life, if that's what the masters chose, but their children were set forward on a path to freedom. That's the first legislative emancipation in American history, in Western history. It's a revolutionary act, although this new generation of scholars, and maybe some older generations of scholars too, have been critical of it in the sense that it was so gradual. There were still some slaves under this law in Pennsylvania, according to the census takers, into the 1840s. But if you read the preamble to the act, it is as earnest an anti-slavery sentiment as you can make, and it is clear in the act that they want to distinguish between chattel slaves and servants, and they want to make clear that the children of the enslaved who are born after 1780 are free, even if they are bounded, and they should be treated as any other indentured servant. Now, that act was passed in 1780. Of course, the Constitutional Convention met in 1787 in Philadelphia, and the next year they amended the Gradual Abolition Act in Pennsylvania, in part in response to the US Constitution, but mostly as a reaction to all the different ways that slaveholders had been trying to evade the law. And they were determined to try to stamp out the pro-slaveryism that was evident in some pockets of Pennsylvania. Now, this to me is the story. This is what I try to teach in my classroom, and we can debate this and talk about it during the Q&A if you want. But what's happening in Pennsylvania from 1780 forward is that the state is a contested borderland. There are pockets of anti-slaveryism and pro-slaveryism, and they each have their triumphs and setbacks. But they work hard in different ways to try to, gain leverage over each other. So in 1788, for example, when they amended the Gradual Abolition Act, they included for the first time personal liberty protections to protect free Blacks from kidnapping. Those personal liberty protections were then expanded in the 1820s. This is not exactly gradual abolition. It's about the rights of free Blacks to be protected from slave catchers. But nonetheless, it's related. And those personal liberty laws are really important. But, this is something, if you are familiar with the literature at all, the kind of classic study in modern years about this has come from Gary Nash and Gene Soderlund, a book called Freedom by Degrees, describing the evolution of post-slavery life in Pennsylvania. Nash and Soderlund call their study Freedom by Degrees. Earlier scholars had talked about the slow rise of freedom after the Gradual Abolition Act, but the current generation of grad students who've been working on this, they've done something pretty remarkable. And that's why I wanted to highlight it for you. What they've managed to do that some of the previous scholars haven't been able to do is to dig into the realities on the ground after 1780. And what they're documenting in a series of dissertations is all of the creative and nefarious ways that the slaveholders tried to continue slaveholding, or how they used forms of servitude as a substitute for slaveholding in the post-1780 period. So I could talk about a lot of details, and maybe I'll do most of that in the Q&A, but I wanted to highlight one example for you here in this timeline. There's a Supreme Court case in Pennsylvania that very few scholars have ever really talked about, but one of these new dissertations coming out of Georgetown by a scholar named Corey Young focuses on this case, Miller v. Dwelling, which is about the kind of remarkable and astonishing practice that emerged in Pennsylvania, where the children of abolition were being held as term slaves or as statutory servants. And I'll describe the difference between those two words in a second. But the point is that if the 1780 law imagined that you could have children who were bound for 28 years, then the slaveholders continued the practice of binding their children for another 28 years until the Supreme Court finally ruled in 1826 that that was an outrage. And if it would continue, that would mean there would be no gradual abolition of slavery. There would just be a perpetuation of a form of servitude in its place. That was also the same year the legislature worked to amend and strengthen the personal liberty law in Pennsylvania, kind of emerging from the original provisions that had been added in 1788 to the amendments to the Gradual Abolition Act. The point that I made a minute ago about words and terminology is kind of important. Corey Young is one of those scholars who says we shouldn't call the children of the gradual abolition period servants. We should call them term slaves. The law, he says, set up a system of slaves for life and then a new regime of slavery, term slaves. I think that's certainly something that we can discuss. But another way to think about it, since the law specifically says these are not slaves, these are servants, is that maybe we should try to think harder about how we discuss servitude. There are different ways to describe servitude. It doesn't just have to be an indenture. And I think a more effective way to think about it in this case is that after 1780, the children of enslaved mothers were statutory servants. They didn't have the choice. They were required to do it. It was coerced. It was a pathway toward freedom. That's what Nash and Soderlund meant by freedom by degrees. But nonetheless, it was a long pathway. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of this in detail now, but I wanted to highlight something for you because I think it is important. The Prigg Supreme Court decision in 1842 swept away the previous personal liberty laws. These are northern states' rights measures designed to protect free Blacks from kidnapping against federal fugitive slave laws. And so some states in the North, led by Massachusetts and soon followed by Pennsylvania, passed a new set of laws. Now, in the 1847 Pennsylvania Personal Liberty Law, which withdrew Pennsylvania's support for the rendition of runaway slaves and left it to the federal government to enforce, they also repealed some aspects of the Gradual Abolition Act that allowed some slaveholders to sojourn with their slaves in Pennsylvania for periods of time, like up to 6 months. And according to most scholars like Nash and Soderlund, that was the end of slavery in Pennsylvania. That's how many people describe it. That's when slavery was completely abandoned in Pennsylvania. But one of the new scholars, a graduate student from Temple named Elliot Drago, he says you should actually consider Pennsylvania to be a slave state until 1847. And yet Corey Young goes even further, and he says the truth is that the personal liberty law doesn't repeal every aspect of term slavery or statutory servitude in Pennsylvania. And you really can't consider slavery totally abolished in Pennsylvania until 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. Now, I know that's a lot to hear all at once, but maybe we could discuss it at greater length, during the Q&A. Of course, you see that there's also the fugitive slave crisis of the 1850s. And one of the things I wanted to highlight for discussion as well later, if anybody is interested, is that there's another young graduate student at Georgetown who came from Dickinson. And while he was here, and even in fact, before he was here, while he was in high school, he wrote a book about the Underground Railroad in South Central Pennsylvania, and did work at Dickinson and for the Dickinson Slavery Project on personal liberty laws and the fugitive slave enforcement system. And, what he found, and this young scholar's name, I think some of you will know him, is Cooper Winger. What he found is that the resistance to the fugitive slave law was quite effective, and that the enforcement of the law in states like Pennsylvania was not nearly as draconian as the intent of the law itself. And the bottom line, like the takeaway from all of this context, is again that there was a battle, a pitched battle between pro and anti-slavery forces in the state of Pennsylvania that ebbed and flowed in ways that had a dramatic impact on the lives of, thousands of Black people. At the time of the passage of the Gradual Abolition Act, there were about 6,000 slaves in Pennsylvania. That number dwindled down to less than 1,000 by 1800, and it remained in the hundreds until it disappeared from the census after 1840. But the number of servants increased, and it's not always clear from the census records whether the census takers were distinguishing properly between term slaves, slaves for life, and wage labor, free labor that was working in white households. So it's a little confusing, but the bottom line is that there were thousands and thousands of Black people from 1780 to 1865 in the state of Pennsylvania who were affected by these laws about slavery and servitude and labor. Now, this is something very familiar to James Buchanan. He grew up in a household where they had indentured servants, they had statutory servants. You're looking at two ads that Dan Guzzi has discovered. He's the retired nuclear engineer from Mercersburg who has become an expert researcher. He shared these with Pat Clark at Wheatland, who shared them with me. I wanted you to look at these documents now after I shared the context from the timeline with you, because they're easier to read when you know the background. When you're looking at an ad from 1816 that says, "To be sold, the time of a stout, healthy Negro boy," this is from James Buchanan's father in Mercersburg. There is a reason why he uses the phrase, "to be sold the time of a stout, healthy boy." He is specifically indicating this is not a chattel sale. This is not the sale of a slave. This is the sale of a servant. That's also what his executors mean after James Buchanan's father died, when they said the time of a small, active colored girl who has almost several years to serve. She was, again, being referenced here as a servant, not as a slave. When we launched the Dickinson and Slavery Project, we looked at the process of manumission from Benjamin Rush and John Dickinson, the founder and the namesake of our college, and both of them repeatedly referred to how they bought the time of their servants, not the bodies of their servants. And to them, that distinction, was important. To the law, that distinction was important. The question that we're going to have to ask is it important enough for us, or was that a euphemism that people back then used to hide something, more nefarious? So let's go back to the manumission document for Daphne and Ann Cook in March of 1835. I want you to look carefully at the passage that I already read again. "Upon this express condition," Anne Henry says, "that the said Daphne and Ann shall remove from and leave the state of Virginia immediately, and that the said Daphne shall be bound according to the laws of Pennsylvania to serve the said James Buchanan." I don't know if anybody thought of this already. I haven't been following the chat while I'm talking. But of course, Daphne and Ann Cook, they're not Pennsylvania born. They're not held in Pennsylvania. The gradual abolition and personal liberty laws that I just described don't apply to them. So what is happening here? This is not quite what Philip Klein described in his biography. I don't know a better way to describe this. I know this is a crude comparison, but what you're looking at here in this manumission document from 1835 is like an aftermarket for manumitted slaves in the Upper South from states like Virginia and Maryland and Delaware that existed in Pennsylvania, where they would be freed, but in a state like Virginia, especially after Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, freed slaves were required to leave the state. And so what Philip Klein was describing as political dynamite wasn't really political dynamite for Buchanan at all. He was offering an outlet for a woman connected to his sister's family's in-laws, who wanted to remove some enslaved people from the state and needed someone to take responsibility for them in Virginia. But there's nothing about this manumission that's enforceable in Pennsylvania. That would have been political dynamite if the abolitionists in 1835 had gotten hold of Buchanan's dealing in servants against all of that background of fighting that I just described about gradual abolition and personal liberty. And so I consulted with a number of scholars. I looked into it myself, talked to Paul Finkelman. I read Corey Young's dissertation. I read Elliot Drago's dissertation. Corey Young is focusing on South Central Pennsylvania. Elliot Drago is focusing on Philadelphia. And what I've discovered, of course, is that the law sets up a framework that creates a new set of conditions where there seems to be indentured Black servants who are manumitted from other states who come into Pennsylvania on the terms of the Gradual Abolition Act. Now, that doesn't have to happen, but it seems to frequently happen, so that Black people are indentured much longer than white people in the 19th century. These children are indentured up to the age of 28. The standard for white indentures, at this point, of course, indentured servitude is dying, but the standard had been about 4 years. For Blacks, under the Gradual Abolition Act, it had been up to 7 years, and that's what it was happening now on an increasing basis for these slaves like the Cooks, who were manumitted in states like Virginia, and then bound to people in Pennsylvania. There's an exhibit at the University of Pittsburgh. They just found a Negro ledger at the Recorder of Deeds office in Allegheny County, and it had a whole host of indentures of stories like the Cooks. And there is an online exhibit at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania Abolition Society papers that has a number of other cases and indenture papers like this. But what we're looking at here is not actually an indenture. We're looking at a manumission from Anne Henry for the Cooks. It's not enforceable in Pennsylvania. We need to see an indenture contract between James Buchanan and Daphne Cook, the mother. But that we don't have yet. I could put Dan Guzzi, the retired nuclear engineer and local historian, to work on it. I don't know if he is at work on it right now. He's not on the call with us tonight, but it's missing. Now, what is there, however, I think of as the most remarkable thing of all. And this is what I wanted to share with you most tonight, because I think those of you who care deeply about James Buchanan and his place in history will find this to be the most stunning thing. This is the new information that wasn't in the Klein biography. On the reverse of the document from 1835, there is a notation in Buchanan's handwriting from that time that says, Anne Cook died Sunday, 28 June, 1835, and then Daphne ran away Tuesday, July 14th, 1835. And to me, this is partly speculation, but I will suggest that what we're looking at is the story of a man recently elected to the US Senate who was attempting to supplement his servants, offering to aid a kind of distant in-law relation who was trying to manumit her slaves. And when they arrived in Pennsylvania, the young girl died and the mother decided to run away. And Buchanan was probably stunned by this. The evidence we have in the record that exists for now doesn't offer us any other examples of him indenturing or bonding servants. He had lots of servants over the course of his lifetime in King Street and at Wheatland, but they seem to be wage servants. This is almost like the story of the second death of another Anne. There's Anne Coleman, and now there's Anne Cook. And that may have been a kind of shocking revelation for Buchanan. It's certainly something that inspires a whole lot of creative rethinking about how to characterize, his attempts at supplementing his household. Now, I also think we can step back and look at this in a much larger sense and put it into a deeper context. Because what we're really talking about when we debate whether or not these servants under the 1780 law should be considered slaves or they should be considered voluntary labor who contracted for long terms is the question and the meaning of the phrase involuntary servitude. Now, you've heard that phrase. It's in the 13th Amendment. Just want to remind you, right, the first section of the 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. We usually teach that or recognize that as a kind of euphemism. Slavery and involuntary servitude are considered almost interchangeable parts. But the phrase derives from the Northwest Ordinance, and you see that above. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in punishment of crimes, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In 1787, servitude was alive and well, and involuntary servitude was a real concern. By 1865, involuntary servitude was something that represented, I think, for the Republicans who are writing this amendment, the lesson that they had learned from the battle against the slave power over the years. In the old Northwest Territory, the pro-slavery forces had evaded the Northwest Ordinance by having long-term servant contracts. In gradual abolition states, they had abolished slavery so slowly that they had created this 28-year condition for statutory servants or term slaves in the state of Pennsylvania. And it was different in other northern states, but it was still slow. And their determination here and their recognition here was that if they didn't make this explicit, if they didn't close every loophole, then the slaveholders might try to evade it. Now, of course, they did evade even this, right? There was slavery by another name in the years after the Civil War in different places in the South, peonage and convict leasing. But you can tell here, I think, that what they're aiming to eliminate from this spectrum of labor in the 19th century is not just chattel slavery, but also these unfair long-term indentures that aren't voluntary at all. So chattel slavery and involuntary servitude are one set of unfree labor conditions, and then indentured servitude and free labor are another set of freer, but still not fairer labor conditions in the 19th century. Indentured servitude, of course, could be, extremely demanding, and the servants could be treated physically like slaves in many ways. And free labor in an era before labor unions and regulatory reform could be extremely, grueling too. So in that context, we have to ask, what kind of servant master was James Buchanan? And, I do think that's an important thing to ask. But before we ask it, I want to give you one last piece of evidence from his nephew, actually the son of his sister Harriet and her husband, Reverend Robert Henry, who had first arranged for the sale of the cooks, the freedom for the cooks and the bonding of the cooks back in 1835. He was raised after his parents died by James Buchanan, and James Buchanan Henry wrote in 1911 in a sketch about his uncle that he could not close this autobiographical sketch without a few words upon his uncle's views on slavery. He claimed that Buchanan simply tolerated it as a legal fact and had no admiration for it. But then listen to this. He says, "I know of a number of instances in which he purchased the freedom of slaves in Washington and brought them to Pennsylvania with him, leaving it to them to repay him if they could out of their wages." Now, I have not yet found any evidence of this. We have to keep looking for evidence of this. But my suspicion is that this is James Buchanan Henry exaggerating from a tale that he knew that involved his parents and his father's relative and the Cooks. And that's how he remembered the story of the Cooks. Whether or not it's true is a different question. But I think for us, we need to ask, was James Buchanan a slaveholder, and recognize that the answer hinges on the distinction between slavery and servitude. He wasn't a slaveholder in the legal sense of the word. He didn't own chattel. He wasn't a slaveholder in the sense of how he viewed himself. For sure, he didn't. And his contemporaries, the vast majority of them didn't, although some of his abolitionist enemies would have clearly been happy to label him a slaveholder because of the way he tried to indenture the Cooks. But when Daphne ran away, when he wrote that on the manumission papers in the summer of 1835, what did she think? That's what we don't know. Did she think of him as this slaveholder? Did she think of him as someone who enabled her liberation, but she just couldn't bear the grief after her daughter died? Did he chase after her like a slave catcher would? Did he put an ad in the local newspaper? On the left of this cartoon, I'm showing you a typical ad from the Lancaster Intelligencer Journal in 1835 for a runaway servant. You'll see that runaway servant ads are much different than runaway slave ads. 6 cents was the reward. Runaway slave ads in the South in this era are gaining rewards much higher than that, $50 or more. But, that's where I want to end this part of the presentation. It's incredibly important for us to know what Daphne Cook thought, and yet we don't. As far as I know, we don't have any ex-servant narratives. All of the scholars, old and new, who've worked on this haven't been able to put together much beyond a few fragments of the people who were in servitude during the period in Pennsylvania from the 1780s to the 1840s. And it would certainly help us if we could find those kind of testimonies to help bring to life this story, which is another reason why I think, even though it doesn't fully answer all of our questions, the story of the Cooks, now that we know more information, now that we know that Anne died and Daphne ran away, I think it offers us, something new and something important, and not just about Buchanan, but about post-abolition life in Pennsylvania as well. Now, before I go to questions, I just wanted to show this credit slide to talk about some of the figures that I've been mentioning. Those young scholars, Drago, Wingard, and Young, who've done such great work in their dissertations. I've been highlighting the work of Dan Guzzi, who's discovered these documents. It's the key to all historical research. I didn't mention yet Douglas Harper, but he's an independent scholar, a Dickinson graduate who created a website called slavenorth.com, which basically takes information from books like Nash and Soderlund's Freedom by Degrees and other works and makes them accessible online. So if you don't have access to some of these books, but you want to see the information, slavenorth.com is a really good place to start. I've also, in this presentation, I've benefited from work by journalists. Jack Brubaker's been writing about this story on and off for a number of years as the scribbler. And there was a great article in the Inquirer 2 years ago by Cassie Owens about the gradual abolition process in Pennsylvania and how it often victimized Blacks as much as it sometimes liberated them. And then I have a list here of the public historians who've been involved. Of course, Pat and his team at Wheatland. I wanted you to remember what we're doing at Dickinson and Slavery, and then those exhibits that I mentioned from Pittsburgh and Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So I want to stop my screen share now and call Pat back to the screen and see if we can start a discussion.
Right. Matt, one of the questions that came up while you had a slide up about the Northwest Territory was the Randolph Harris. Randy wanted to know if you could describe the area included in the territory.
Well, the Northwest Territory went from Ohio out to Wisconsin, and it was, what we call the Old Northwest now. It was the Northwest then. I have studied this because Illinois was part of the Northwest Ordinance, and in Illinois they had long-term servitude, and they had what they called French slaves, and all kinds of ways that the pro-slavery forces there evaded this prohibition on slavery and involuntary servitude. And all of this was in the minds of Republicans when they wrote the 13th Amendment. Many states since the Northwest Ordinance had written in that provision. Many Western and Northwestern states had written in that provision into their, constitutions to prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude. And everyone had seen, how, as important as that was, how it still didn't stop the kind of slavery by another name forces that were hard at work.
So Robin posts a question for you. What would change about your interpretation of Buchanan's presidency if we answered the question, was James Buchanan a slaveholder, in the affirmative?
For me, it doesn't change a thing. I think for people who are interested in his biography, it's important. But I have more than enough information from his public career to call him a doughface, a pro-slavery figure. I recognize and understand the depth of his sense of unionism or nationalism, but what was clear even back in 1835 was that he was already arraying himself against the abolitionists. He blamed all sectional problems on them and nothing on the slaveholders. Maybe his nephew was correct. He had no particular affection for slavery, may have even despised it. I'm not inside his heart or his head. But in his public actions, he was almost as pro-slavery as a Northern politician could be. And I think that was because he blamed the wrong forces for the nation's problems.
Okay. Another question from Robert. Did Buchanan ever have actual possession of the cooks? Did they arrive in Pennsylvania?
Right. So my suspicion is that he did. According to the manumission papers, they were supposed to be immediately removed to Pennsylvania. The fact that he wrote this notation on the back of the manumission papers and that this document was in his papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania suggests that sometime between March and June, the cooks arrived in Pennsylvania or were taken to Lancaster, and he had them in service until Daphne ran away in July.
Right. Here's another question. If we accept that Buchanan's efforts were a sincere attempt to save the Union as well as the Democratic Party, did those efforts have a chance of succeeding?
No chance at all. Look, forgive me, I'm a Lancastrian, but I'm a Lincoln scholar. And, everything Buchanan did made the situation worse, despite his good intentions. And that was because he was a master at divisiveness within his own party. He broke apart the Democratic Party. And then he was passive at first, at least, in the face of the secessionists, which enabled the breaking of the Union to take place as well. I certainly believe, that a different approach might have worked, but I know that his approach was doomed to failure.
Something popped up in the chat here, a couple of different questions. Can you compare manumitted slaves in Pennsylvania to sharecroppers in the South?
That's a great question. In Pennsylvania, we actually had a form of sharecroppers. They called them cottagers. I had that spectrum of labor and I stopped at free labor. But what I should have included were cottagers, the kind of sharecroppers, the former Black enslaved people who worked on farms, and of course, faced the same debt cycle that the sharecroppers faced in the South. It was a struggle. Nash and Soderlund described their lives in great detail. And it's a worthwhile, comparison to make.
Yeah.
And I should add one other detail that I didn't get a chance to talk about a few minutes ago. So after the 13th Amendment, there was also a spike in servitude again. But the servitude of the 19th century, post-emancipation in the United States, was for Asians. And there was a traffic in the globe during the post-Civil War period, not only in Chinese labor, but also in Indian labor. And it was for the United States and for the Caribbean. And there was an interest in replacing slaves with Asian servants on long-term indentures, either for debt or for term. And, this is just another example of how creative different capitalists and plantation masters can be when they're trying to find and coerce labor. And so it's a perennial story. It's one that we tend to ignore, especially in the classroom. It's like we can't get to that. But we probably should, because people need to think about servitude. Calling Buchanan a servant owner is still something important. It's not the same thing as slaveholding, but it still can be, quite revealing and terrible. And we need to think about it. We need to understand it.
Good point. Another question. What distinction do you draw between involuntary servitude and indentured servitude for Black indentured people who had no choice or agency in their servitude?
Well, that's the right question to ask. And I think you answer it on a case-by-case basis. At the Pittsburgh exhibit, they have an indenture for a 6-year-old girl. Now, the theory was apparently that a child who could indenture herself toward freedom was doing it voluntarily. But that we would never accept that from our perspective. It seems like a total fraud, fiction. But it's conceivable that you could make an argument that Daphne Cook would voluntarily indenture herself to James Buchanan in order to liberate herself and her daughter from slavery in Shepherdstown, even if it meant service for years in Pennsylvania. It's conceivable. She might not like it, but it might be the lesser of two evils. And so that's a distinction between an indentured servitude, as tough as it was for Black people, and involuntary servitude. Now, like I said, we can't find the indenture, or at least we haven't yet, between Buchanan and the Cooks. But if it exists, then we might know more.
Gene Bordowich asks, did Buchanan have any personal relationship with local abolitionists apart from the occasional meal with Thad Stevens?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Pat can answer that question. I can't answer that question off the cuff. What I keep saying to myself is, if Thaddeus Stevens was living in Lancaster at the time when the Cooks were in town, and they had stumbled upon him or somebody had pointed them over to him, I guarantee you he would have been perfectly happy to file habeas corpus petition on their behalf and get them out of Buchanan's possession. Any good abolitionist lawyer would have. He wasn't able to hold them under Pennsylvania law. And I think that if they had just found the right lawyer, they might have been able to realize that kind of freedom.
Yeah, I've heard, I have to just call it a rumor because I've yet to find his brother Edward's sermon one of the sermons. We've got several in the collection, but I've not found any that meet this definition. But someone wrote Buchanan a letter back during his presidency that his brother was delivering some sort of abolitionist type sermons in Philadelphia at his church. Buchanan didn't react very surprised, but that's possible that his brother was an abolitionist. That would have been his youngest sibling. So, Corey Young says, in typical scholarly fashion, I have a comment and a question. First, I would like to thank Dr. Pinsker for referencing my work. It's very kind of him to have engaged with my dissertation, considering how recently I completed it. My comment is that we would do well to think about how the Pennsylvania State Assembly failed to abolish slavery completely in the 1820s, in part because certain anti-slavery representatives would not countenance a bill that prevented the manumit and indenture mechanism that Buchanan utilized in the 1830s. So in this way, a disdain for Southern lifetime slavery actually slowed the emancipation process in Pennsylvania itself. Now for my question. At what point does our qualification of the kind of unfreedom that young Black people experienced in Pennsylvania after 1780 stop being analytically useful? Does long-term hereditary statutory servant get us somewhere that term slave does not. My apologies for the paragraph. I do wish we could be safely in.
All right. So, as much as I admire the work of, Corey and Elliot and others who are, holding the realities up in front in our face, sometimes I do find their political analysis to be unrealistic. The way Corey was just criticizing the Pennsylvania legislature, to me, underestimates the obstacles that the anti-slavery forces faced, or misrepresents the achievements that the timeline I offered suggest. And he may think it's abstract, but to me, right, this goes to the heart of why the fight for principle was important. Keeping the word slavery out of the Constitution was a way to say the Constitution doesn't endorse the chattel principle. The fight to distinguish servants, even if they're statutory and their servitude is involuntary, from chattel, from human property, is important, even if in reality some masters could treat them the same. And Corey is skeptical of that. A lot of scholars are. Many of you might be. That's a fair debate to have, but I do believe that step one is you have to draw a line on these principles, and then step two is you have to address the realities, and then step three is you have to accelerate the process toward equality. Now, that's a lot, but that's what the debate has been about. If you go back to Edward Turner and you look at Nash Soderlund and you look at Corey Young and Elliot Drago, they're all trying to convey this complexity. They have different points of emphasis, and some of them, like Corey did, find new evidence, in cases like Miller v. Dwelling that other people have overlooked, and that's what makes it interesting. And I hope, in some way, some small way, this discovery Dan Guzzi made about the notation on the manumission papers will also add to this body of knowledge and this conversation.
Another question that wants you to take a look at Buchanan in the context of how poor he did with his domestic policy, and think about the question of, would any president who actually did serve between Jackson and Lincoln likely have done any better than Old Buck? Put differently, could anyone or anything have prevented the Civil War? And if avoiding the war meant continuing slavery in the South, is that an end to be wished for?
Well, I just talked about this in the classroom today. What I told my students was there was nothing inevitable about the war. The conflict was inevitable, but they could have kept finding ways to, as one of my students put it this morning, kick the can down the road. There were always politicians willing to make compromises. That's what made the election of Lincoln so critical. I even think most of the other Republicans who would have been in that office at that position in April 1861 would have found ways to compromise. But Lincoln wouldn't. And, of course, ultimately that was the right decision despite the cost. But I do think different leadership, even in Buchanan's troubled period, might have made a difference. But Buchanan's attempts, as well-intentioned as they were sometimes, and sometimes they were malicious, but in his best moments, when he was truly a nationalist, he still stumbled over a lot of issues, especially in managing his own party. And that's one of the things that made the collapse of the Union accelerate.
Yeah. Two more questions, and then I think we're going to probably close this. What rights did indentured servants have? Did they have the right to vote? Do they have due process in the courts?
Yeah. So in the gradual abolition statutes, they say the servants created by this law, the children born after 1780, will have all the rights of white servants. And those rights were quite limited. You're not going to be impressed by them, right? They have the rights to, go to court if they're treated cruelly. They have the rights to some freedoms dues, which in this case, the norm back then was 2 suits of clothing, one of which was to be new. This is not exactly a rewarding system for labor. In some places in the North, they were supposed to be educated. There was an expectation for some type of education, although in reality, it was quite limited. But the bottom line was none of us would be satisfied by any of these conditions. But the truth is, none of us would be satisfied by the way they treated free labor either. And so we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. The conditions and the standards were utterly different for white and black. And of course, it was always worse for black.
All right, final question. We know we recently, a couple of years back, acquired a letter at an auction where Buchanan wrote to a friend that the fugitive slave law from the Compromise of 1850 should be held inviolate. Does this comment paint him as a pro-slavery citizen, or does it simply paint him as a dogmatic law enthusiast?
I think the right way to interpret that particular line is that he's portraying himself as a law and order unionist, and that it's part of what he considers to be the compromises necessary to keep the union intact. Right. That's the short answer.
Okay. One last question. What were the freedoms of indentured servants versus slaves?
So, this is what the new scholarship tells us. There's two different categories. There's the freedoms implied by the law, and then there's the freedoms that are delivered in reality. And you always have to remember those are two different things. We post speed limits on the highway. That doesn't mean people follow them. So in the Gradual Abolition Act, they carve out specific terms that are supposed to apply. If they're treated cruelly, they're supposed to have access to the courts. They're supposed to get some freedom dues, the clothing. They're supposed to have some education and training. They're supposed to be treated as free people with the rights of free people, although their time, their labor is bound. They're supposed to have the protection from having their families taken apart. But in reality, all of those provisions aren't necessarily held to be true.
Right. Well, Matt, thanks very much for this great insight into slavery, the strange institution that it was, and Buchanan's connection with it.
And servitude, Pat. Remember,
and servitude. Right. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Upon leaving this Zoom, a window will pop up with our post-event survey. The survey is completely voluntary, but we'd love to know your thoughts. We really would, especially about tonight's program, as well as any type of future programming you might consider suggesting to us. We'll also be posting, as Emily noted earlier, a recording of tonight's presentation on our YouTube channel in the upcoming days, so stay tuned for that. And you can now also register for our next presidential lecture, Buchanan and the Mysticism of the Law, featuring Alvernia University's Dr. Tim Blessing. The lecture will be held on Thursday, November 4 at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, also on Zoom. To register, you can go to LancasterHistory.org/events to sign up today. Thank you all for having and have a great night.